May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. This morning is a very appropriate time to be reading together from Amos, the prophet known for his powerful words about justice. As has been mentioned already in the service this morning, yesterday evening there was a Trump campaign rally in Butler, just up the road from us, where a young man attempted to assassinate the former president. The shooter and another person attending the rally are both dead, and at least one or two others were injured. And so this morning we mourn not just the death of a young man who felt hope could only be found in violence, and that of a rally-goer who was in that young man's way. We lament that the world seems to have lost its whole darn mind. Like every other preacher I talked to last night and this morning, I couldn't not rethink everything I had prepared to say this morning. But I do think that the lectionary passage from Amos today is still very appropriate to the situation. In fact, this timing can give us a deeper insight into the passage and what God is trying to tell us through the prophet Amos. Because what happened yesterday is a concrete example of exactly what we are meant to be the counter-narrative to in the world. This passage is all about being a counter-narrative in the world. The vision that Amos shares here to demonstrate God's counter-narrative of justice is that of a plumb line, like I showed the children in the children's sermon. Now, when I'm hanging something on the wall of my house, I do not actually use a level or a plumb line, and it's not because I don't know what they are or how to use them. I even knew where to find them in our basement this weekend. I don't use them because our house was built in 1920. It is 104 years old. It does not matter how technically straight you hang the thing in my house. It's always going to look crooked. I'm sure that a plumb line was used in the construction of our house, but after more than a century, the entire building is very, very crooked. Our passage today shows a vision of God measuring the holiness of God's people. They are a people who were built well with all the right tools, but they aren't measuring up any longer. They look okay, but they are not okay. They are powerful, they are big and flashy, they have all sorts of programs and events, the pews are full. But in Amos, the plumb line being held up to the people is measuring their commitment to God's kingdom, not theirs. It is measuring them based on the way they treat the people around them, not on the production quality of their religious life. God has charged Amos with revealing the people to be as crooked as a 104-year-old house in Pittsburgh. Generally, when we think about the prophet Amos, the first thing that comes to mind is a verse not long before this passage in Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In that section, Amos tells the people of Israel how little God cares about their selfishly pious and empty feasts and assemblies. He is telling them that they, like so many of our churches today, have forgotten the message of justice and compassion for one another that the law and the prophets have long championed. They have allowed themselves to get swept away in what the world says justice and holiness are, and have conflated religion with nationalism. Our passage today is the expansion of that foundation Amos has laid out. The empty religion that the people here are practicing didn't show up overnight, of course. The people of Israel didn't set off to write God and God's kingdom out of their story. There was no concerted effort to become less and less just and kind and compassionate. It just happened over time as they got too comfortable in the abundance around them. So far, my crooked old house has been worth fixing, and we have been fortunate enough to have the skills and the means to do so. But a house as old as ours that has not been cared for and jacked up and repointed is in big trouble. There was one of those down the street a number of years ago that was really bad. Throughout the years, the folks who were there must not have had the means or the skills to keep it up, or maybe they just didn't realize how far gone it was. And when the last people to live in it moved out, the house was condemned by the city and eventually torn down. Both houses became a bit crooked over the years, but one was ignored until it fell down, and the other was adjusted and worked on. Our house was not intentionally built crooked, I think. But years of people walking and running and dancing through it, of cooking and eating and spilling, of squirrels on the roof and birds bathing in the gutters, of unstable Western Pennsylvania soil, of parties and wakes and neighbors just dropping by, of tree roots by the foundation and rain and snow hitting the bricks from all angles. Years of dogs and cats and babies and teenagers and babies again, of various leaks and fixes and layers of paint, of life and death, of floor replacements, new wiring, and a retrofitting of central air conditioning. Years of life took their toll on the house. Some of those events were immediately damaging and had to be fixed right away. Others slowly chipped away at the posture of our home until a visible crack formed, or a porch pillar's gradual slide to the left became ever so slightly visible. Some of those events were beautiful, and the memories will long outlast us and maybe even the house and the photos and stories we and the people who inhabited that house before us leave behind with our children and our grandchildren. Of course, nobody's line will fall perfectly plumb, only Jesus. But just like we can mitigate the effects of time on a physical house, we can figuratively put posts in the basement to straighten out the floor some, and we can repoint and put up new gutters and fix the plaster and get our life as close as we can to plumb. Close enough to keep the house standing and livable. I recently learned a new phrase that I'm going to start using all the time because it's very satisfying to say. Half a bubble out of plumb. What a great visual that is. So close to being aligned perfectly, but not quite perfect. The bubble doesn't quite make it in between the lines. Oh, my dear friends, it's okay to be half a bubble out of plumb. The world's on fire, and we are all doing our best out here, and none of us are Jesus. And maybe thinking about it that way gives us a little more grace for ourselves and for the people around us. It's so hard to hold the plumb line of justice and compassion to the life of a congregation. There are a lot of people involved, and we are all half a bubble out of plumb. We're a neighborhood full of slightly crooked houses in a world with a lot of sinkholes and squishy ground to slide down into. It's so hard to do this because in a world that's changing at breakneck speed, the church is what has remained unchanged in so many ways for so many of us, and there is a comfort in something that has not changed. It's hard to figure this all out Because some of the very things that have brought us comfort and abundance and joy, some of the traditions and practices and programs that have nurtured us through the years, are now what's causing us to go out of alignment just a tiny bit more. But just like a house lived in without change or update or infrastructure adjustments, it does us no good to simply live in it exactly as it is until it is crumbling down around us. The house unchanged will find itself condemned. Years of funerals and baptisms and confirmations and weddings, of communions and choirs, of Sunday school and sermons, of pastoral transitions and knockdown, drag-out arguments in session meetings, of congregational meetings and splits and mergers, of church matriarchs and patriarchs come and gone, of community outreach events and vacation Bible school. Years of life take their toll on a congregation. Wear away and shift the figurative bricks ever so much. All are signs of life lived fully. But even the good parts of life leave behind wear and tear on a home. Even the good parts of life leave wear and tear on a community. It takes work to stay standing in this broken and frightening world. But we have to take this work seriously, lest we become a house condemned, like the one here in Amos. You don't have to fix all the cracks overnight. In fact, jacking up a wall too fast will cause other damage. But you do have to take time regularly to hold up the plumb line and see how you as a people are measuring up to God's call. There's a lot of doom and gloom in Amos, but it ultimately ends in hope. In Amos 9:11 through 15, God promises to build the people back up again. It will not necessarily be the same individual people in the same exact building, but God will help them rebuild on top of the ruins. God does not measure us because God is a fan of smiting people. God holds up the plumb line to show us how much better things can be. The churches that take this seriously and lean into it are the ones who are going to survive the turbulent times all of our churches are struggling with now. I will be the first to tell you, I'm definitely a half a bubble out of plum. I'll also be the first to tell you, I am a completely different person and a completely different pastor than I was before I started doing ministry in the jail. Being in the midst of extreme suffering for an extended time brings a new light and power to the gospel that we just cannot experience if we stay in the safety of our comfort zones. I've seen both despair and hope in the darkest places. I've learned valuable lessons in compassion, grace, self-care, and boundaries. Surely Jesus tells us to be with the people on the edges of society because we are all new and different when we have taken the time to listen to another person's story. Most days I question if the work I do there makes a difference in the world at all because it never seems to make a dent in the suffering. But I've never questioned if my time there is good and holy and worth it because I know it has changed me. The whole world looks different than it did before because God's work changes us. It changes how we see the world. It changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we worship and pray and study together. As churches, we can start by looking at our mission life together. Do we just look like a slightly better version of everything else around us in the world? Or are we actually different? God doesn't care how much money we gave or how many programs we have started. How have we been changed, individually and as a community, by the mission we do? This work shifts our floors back into place a little bit. And in a world full of people doubling down and refusing to change or hear another perspective, a community willing to change and to listen is something truly noticeable. Many people in our country are scared for their lives and well-beings and those of their loved ones, and rightfully so in today's political climate. Regardless of whether you find yourself sympathizing more with the young man with a gun or with the former president on a stage, as a faithful people, we cannot accept that violence and retaliation are the answer to our nation's problems. In a world where a 20-year-old with his whole life ahead of him sees no options for hope aside from attempting to assassinate a controversial public figure, holding the church up as a place of compassion and peace, counter to the violence and the meanness, is exactly the sort of upside down from the world way that God asks us to be. And people notice that just as much or more than they notice when the church is just going along with the flow and ignoring their pain. One of my very favorite songs is "Be More Kind" by Frank Turner. You should all write that down and look it up on your phones on the way home this morning and listen to it in the car or the bus or the walk home. It is not an explicitly Christian song, but it is a beautiful example of the desire in the world for something different than what we see in the news day in and day out. The first verse starts, "History's been leaning on me lately. I can feel the future breathing down my neck. And all the things I thought were true when I was young, and you were too, turned out to be broken. And I don't know what comes next. In a world that has decided that it's going to lose its mind, be more kind, my friends. Try to be more kind. Our world is craving compassion and kindness. My hope for you, friends, the blessing that I leave with you today, is that you will be willing and faithful to measure and see who it is that God desires your congregation to be in this broken, troubled, hurting, frightened world. That you would be a beacon of compassion and justice and peace. There is hope for new life and growth in the church community and in every single person within it when we are willing to grow into being more kind. It's not going to look exactly like the old Life and Growth did, because this world looks so very different than it used to. Every house changes through the years, and that is good, and it is holy, and it is right. Amen.